welcome everyone, and it's auspicious the sun has come out.
Yes.
My name is Will McIntosh, and I'm standing here before you today to celebrate the marriage of Rebecca and Kevin. I'm an old friend of Kevin's, and we lived together our freshman year in our dorm in college 13 years ago. And I also now count myself an old friend of Rebecca's. I've known her since the early days of their relationship, and I've had the great pleasure of knowing them together as a couple since that time. It is this history that has led them to ask me to officiate at their wedding, which is such a deep and profound honor that I'm only too happy to oblige. In my day job, I'm a historian, so when I'm presented with a meaningful task like joining Rebecca and Kevin in marriage, I'm inclined to look at it through the lens of the past. I think in this case that instinct is especially appropriate because these two people stand here before us today at a moment in their lives that is both wholly new and also deeply rooted in tradition. Thus, with your permission, I'd like to talk a little bit about the history of marriage, that interplay between old and new that has brought us to today's special happy moment. If there's one thing that historians have taught us about marriage, it's that its nature is always changing. Every generation's idea of marriage is a little bit different from their parents', so that over time, the substance of marriage has changed in some fundamental ways. This is obvious if we think about it. How many of us look at our parents or our children and see a direct reflection of our own lives? These subtle generational differences build up in the grand scope of time into big changes that historians can trace. I recently asked a Schlotman family friend how old he thought the trees around here were. He told me that probably 200 years is a good guess. That means that when these trees were just small saplings, marriage in America was primarily an economic arrangement, secondarily a spiritual bond, and only thirdly a romantic affair. The men and women who lived in these hills here were mostly farmers, as you can see from the endless stone walls driving up here. Farming the hills of New York and New England was backbreaking labor. It was also labor that required a family to perform, and thus marriage was critical to the economic survival of both men and women. If a young couple had gotten married on this land when these small saplings were underfoot, they most likely would have married out of material need rather than romantic inspiration. This is not to say that they would not have liked or even loved each other, but romance was not their primary concern or the main point of their arrangement. Or perhaps it is better to say that marriage and romance would not necessarily have been synonymous in their minds. But as these trees were growing into their energetic views at 30 or 40 years old, important changes were sweeping through American culture. The widespread changes of the Industrial Revolution were restructuring the place and meaning of work. The family was no longer the fundamental unit of the American economy. Instead, labor and production happened in the workshop, in the factory, and in the office. As families became less important for material survival, they became more important for emotional sustenance. The people who lived in these hills farmed less and worked more in the mills of Danbury, or the factories of Bridgeport, or in the offices of New York City. They began to think of their families at home in Pound Ridge as havens of love and support, rather than as a team dedicated to their survival. At the same time, the legal status of marriage began to change. Women had traditionally been subservient to their husbands. Men were the unquestioned head of their household, representing its interest to the outside world and demanding obedience at home. Most shockingly, perhaps to us, in most American states, the principle of coverture was the law of the land. Coverture, which was inherited from English common law, was the legal principle that married women had no legal identity apart from that of their husbands. They were all, for all legal purposes, one person, and that one person was the husband. Blackstone's 1765 Commentary on the Laws of England explained the principle thus. By marriage, the husband and wife are one person in law. That is, the very being or legal existence of the woman is suspended during the marriage, or at least incorporated and consolidated into that of the husband, under whose wing, protection, and cover she performs everything, and is therefore called a femme covert. In its more extreme forms, coverture led to absurdities, like husbands being prosecuted for the crimes of their wives. Believe it or not, coverture was the law in New York until the Married Women's Property Act was passed in 1848, which gave married women a legal identity distinct from their husbands and allowed them to own property in their own names. As a result, by the middle of the 19th century, marriage began to take a form that seems more familiar to us, as an emotionally significant relationship between two legally distinct, if not precisely equal, partners. But there was still much about 19th century marriage that would seem alien to us. Only the poorest married women worked outside the household, and only then because they had to. More significantly, husbands and wives often spent relatively little time together. They spent the bulk of their time, and much of their emotional energy, on friends and family members of the same gender. Married women lived in the world of sisters, cousins, mothers, children, neighbors, and married men lived in the world of brothers, fathers, friends, business associates. These separate spheres, as historians have called them, often occupied the majority of married people's days, and their marriages were fit in around the edges. All this began to change as our trees here reached their powerful maturity. When they were about 100 years old, in the first decades of the 20th century, the model of companionate marriage was beginning to become more popular. In companionate marriages, husband and wives were supposed to be best friends and primary confidants, as well as lovers, parents, and colleagues in raising children. Many changes brought about this new model of companionate marriage. Economic development and political reform increased the amount of time that workers had off, bringing about the modern weekend and the modern vacation. The women's movement, which had gotten its start fighting those coverture laws back in the 1840s, achieved the women's vote in 1919, finally making women the full political equals. And suburbanization increasingly separated the fields of home and work. Places like Pound Ridge were no longer really working communities. Men commuted to work in far-off places and returned home to their wives and best friends in the evening and on the weekends. And the forest began to cover the stone walls that would surround us. By the 1950s, companionate marriage had reached its apogee. If you watched Leave It to Beaver in your youth, or if you've seen it on late-night reruns, you know the kind of family of which I speak. As our trees began to enter their wise old age, so too did marriage. Most of you are familiar with the upheavals that reshaped our country in the 1960s and 1970s. Most notably, the women's rights movement began to create new opportunities for women both inside and outside of the home. Married women went to work in ever-increasing numbers, both out of necessity and also because the new challenges presented by the work world of the late 20th century appealed to them. The final vestiges of coverture were erased when married women won the right to have credit in their own names in 1975. As they grew into adulthood, the men of the baby boom became more involved with parenting than their fathers had been. The social, cultural, and economic turbulence of the 60s and 70s put the final polishing touches on the changes that had been building throughout the life of the trees around us, creating marriages in which two partners, both lovers and friends, work together inside and outside the home to surmount life's challenges as a team.